getting into this mode of starting with something that I hope would grab your attention and that I hope you would remember. And you tell me if this is an attention grabber as a fact. If I already said it, forgive me, I'm old. American children consume 3 times the amount of ADHD medication, listen carefully, as the rest of the world combined. 3 times the amount of ADHD medication. Actually, I've seen that figure as high as 5 times. I suppose it depends on which year. Because consumption is going up, as you know. But I think it's an interesting statistic. Actually, I think it's a disturbing statistic, especially when you consider the fact that now some school systems who may be underfunded are looking to ADHD medication for normal children to increase focus on the assumption that that will help them increase school performance. I guess that would be okay if it helped school performance, wouldn't it? But guess what? All kinds of data shows neurological effects, some positive, like increased concentration, focus, less fidgetiness. But I'll bet very little of the population of the world is aware that there's no evidence it increases academic performance in the long run as we measure academic performance, i.e. by grades. Moreover, I always like to point out, I think when those medications are prescribed, parents should be told, we're putting your children or your child on speed. They have better names for it that are more sophisticated. But as William Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name, it smells sweet. Okay, enough on that, but that is your interesting fact for today, at least interesting in my opinion. I hope you found it interesting. Let's move on to the review of science. You guys are just completely ready, very sophisticated with regard to test 1. You are test 1 sophisticated, that's what I'm trying to say. Let's look at what we're trying to do in science. And I think it's so important. I mean, it is so important. When you look at the public impression, I think we're living in a world today, a dangerous, dangerous world that is becoming, by choice, less and less informed by science and more informed by marketing and news. That's why the statistic I just quoted to you, to me, is disturbing. Because it's accountable, that statistic is accountable based on marketing and not science. Somehow we tend to ignore, or we're given less of a dose as a public of what science finds. In fact, I think, in fact, a large part due to the previous administrations of our government, the American public is even more distrusting of scientists and distrusting of what's found in the laboratory. Otherwise, wouldn't everybody believe in climate change by now? But as you know, the public is very ambivalent about it because science is not the only informing agency. The political, in fact, socio-political, economic structure has much more money to inform than science does. I can't begin to overstate how important what I just said is to your future. Not necessarily to mine, but definitely to yours. All right, so what do scientists do? They employ a set of assumptions about the nature of the universe. And they attempt to find truth as best they can about is true about the universe and what is not. And they do so with a very well-developed system that all scientists agree to use as we pursue new knowledge about the universe. And this is called, of course, the scientific method. It has with it the assumption that the universe is ordered. And in its order, we can find relationships between variables in the universe, sometimes with such a degree of sophistication that we can send off a rocket and have it meet up with a meteor and hit it almost on a bullseye, because we know that the laws of physics and physics itself is a science that's been around as long as science has. And when we have the mathematical articulation of the process by which that happens, it's because it has been so thoroughly studied that this cause and effect relationship is very well understood. I like to think of those sciences as the simple sciences, not the complex hard sciences, the simple ones, because it's all figured out mathematically already. Who can find anything in this universe more complex than human behavior? It is indeed the last frontier. What we know about the brain will certainly help, but what we know about behavior and its determinants, usually most of which is in the environment in which the living organism behaves, will be the real challenge of the future. But there's a problem. When I dropped that tablet, you would all agree that it satisfies our assumption about the universe having events that are determined by identifiable factors. In that case, what we know about gravity and the conditions of the atmosphere in which I actually dropped that tablet, and blah, blah, blah. Many of you know much more about that than I. And when a biochemical reaction is made to occur in a chemistry laboratory, there's no question about that effect having been determined by an identifiable cause that the chemist has isolated. Or in the biological laboratory, when they modify a specific physiological, say, cardiovascular response and can predict with near certainty the nature of the response elsewhere in that system, clearly no one has any difficulty thinking about how those events are determined by causal factors. Enter the very unusual scientific arena of psychology. Here we must carry with us the same set of assumptions and employ the same research methodologies to identify truth about human behavior. But in so doing, we must establish and indeed embrace the assumption of determinism. If we were to instead assume something like free will, why study it? Because the answer to every human behavioral question is, she decided to. I mean, there would be no science of behavior, there would be no psychology as a behavioral science if we abandon that necessary scientific assumption that all events are determined. And all we need to do in here now defines the essence of research methodology. We must isolate the causal variable, you know what as independent variable, that is affecting the outcome variable, you know it as the dependent variable. But we must do so to the exclusion of all other sources of influence on that dependent variable. In psychology, invariably, nearly invariably, the outcome variable The dependent variable is behavior. It is some aspect of behavior. The independent variables may be any number of things. Someone may or may not report being depressed. That's probably not going to be enough of a good measure of that dependent variable depression. So we might give that person affect depression inventory that has 60 questions on which they can score which has 21 questions, on which they can score as high as 65 or something like that. And we'll say if they score about 15, this verifies the behavior they're reporting as, in fact, being depressed. So that now becomes an outcome, a dependent measure, a dependent variable, that obviously we have a lot of interest in with regard to identifying the causal factors. Now, some would say, if you're depressed, you woke up one morning with a fever. No, I don't mean a fever, an imbalanced neurotransmitter system. I obviously made that mistake on purpose to show you that obviously it can't be as simple as that, and that's why what we have visited and will visit in the way of biological understanding as a single determinant factor for these complex, enormously complex phenomena will never be enough. It's way too simple to expect that one little neurotransmitter system is biochemically imbalanced, is insufficiently supporting the emotional wherewithal of the individual to account for that person reporting all of the things that we know of as depression, that you will come to know very well in this course. It is important to know other things, some of which are psychological. Psychologists tend to look at environmental factors that affect behavior. It is not insignificant, is it, that a depressed individual may have had her spouse leave her recently, and it would not be in that instance accidental that the spouse left and the person hours or perhaps days later is reporting being depressed. So when they wake up depressed, should we look for the neurotransmitter imbalance? Or should we ask the question, what just happened in the life of this individual for them to be reporting being that sad? And I think proof that so much of this is woven into the fabric of the environment is that if her spouse came back a few days later and said, boy, was that stupid of me, I will now love you for the rest of my life. How fast will the neurotransmitter imbalance correct itself at that moment in time? So my point here is to emphasize what psychology does emphasize and what we will emphasize throughout the course, the importance of experience on what we will be examining under the old rubric of mental illness and the new term mental disorder. So an independent variable then for someone being depressed may well be the identification of what happened recently in the life of the individual who's reporting being that sad, so sad that they have become dysfunctional. And it may well be, in the model that we introduced to you a while back, the bio-psycho-socio-cultural model, that indeed her biology was traumatized by this unexpected event. But it was the event that did the trauma. So there were bio-psycho-sociologic issues. She's got to call mom and say, guess who left? Is never coming back. Mom may support her or not support her. The family may rally around her and help her through this stressful event, softening the effect of this blow. Hence, we would, and some, by the way, some ethnic groups do a much better job sociologically of providing immediate and intense support, social support to family members than other ethnic groups. Hence, socio-cultural factors. All of these factors must be understood. And indeed, we full well know that you drop off the last one altogether. If that person's spouse was the only important and meaningful social item in their social structure, and they left and they had nothing else because they were really very isolated socially, not only could this person report the kinds of things that we say are the dependent variable of depression, that psychological death may ultimately eventuate in an early physical death. You'll come to learn in this course, if we get there, that truthfully stress, and if you want to use this term, the human mind as a psychological entity will trump the body every time. Ultimately, it is to a large extent the psychological, even the psychosocial element of a person's life that accounts for this is the way scientists call it, accounts for most of the variance associated with the outcome. And this is what we do with the bio-psycho-socio-cultural model. We say, how much of the variance is accounted for by the biological factors we can identify, how much by psychological, how much by socio and sociocultural factors. We try to partition it out to see not only which factors are most potent, but from a clinical standpoint, which factors are the factors on which we need to intervene. But yes?
I actually have an example of this past weekend. This lady passed away, and when the doctors, because they were like, she went to the hospital, and it only took like an hour and a half. And the doctors actually said that she wasn't sick with anything, well, like big, and then the doctor said that it was where she was like it created this.
She was socially isolated?
Yeah. It created like a heart attack.
Yeah. Mother Teresa, she said that she just learned of an instance in which someone died here in the valley over the weekend that was socially isolated, and the doctor was convinced that that was the primary source of the variance that we call death in this case. For her, I say that's a good doctor. He's looking at more than her biochemistry. He's looking at her entire life space and the meaningfulness of her life. How many people have heard of Mother Teresa? Yay. You know, her death went unnoticed. Does anybody know why? Because Princess Di died on the same day. So almost no one noticed that Mother Teresa, who I believe that there is such a thing as a saint, is a saint. And saying our hospitals are filled with casualties of loneliness. And we'll return to that. It's a huge factor in what keeps us alive, is our meaningful social connectiveness to other human beings. Those are all variables. Now, everything we've been talking about, her death, her social isolation, I've just identified for you, if one were to study this in a larger group of people, and we will look at this, by the way, how spouses survive the death of their own spouse. Some do pretty well, others don't do so well. I'll bet you there are people in this room who know of people, older people who lived together for a long time. One spouse died, and the other spouse didn't die, they stopped living. And eventually, they did die. Enormously powerful. Well, how do we look at this from a scientific standpoint? Social isolation, social support is an independent variable. The quantitative amount is if you have social support. Some have more than others. Some have almost none. And when you compare these two groups from the standpoint of medical and psychological outcome, dependent variable, you find alarming, strong relationships. This is what behavioral scientists do, and social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists. They try to isolate the effects of these very powerful variables and try to understand their individual influence on these dependent variables to the exclusion of all other sources of influence. Therein lies the real problem in being a scientist. i.e. it is necessary to isolate the effect of that variable to the exclusion of all other sources of influence when one has not or has neglected to include excluding one variable that might account for the relationship that you are arguing is related to the variable you've isolated. We have a special variable called a confounding variable. It is the nightmare of the scientists. Scientists, I'm going to give you a name, have committed suicide over not accounting for confounding variables in very important studies that they have published, in which they are making and drawing conclusions about the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable, but missed it because there is another variable associated with their independent variable that could just as easily account for the difference they found. This is called confounding, and now you know everything there is to know, really, about the business of science in terms of the activity. The search method then is, again, isolating the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable to the exclusion of all other sources of influence. Yes?
One of the reasons why I hope you doesn't come that women being longer sometimes because they get more social support.
Yes. He just commented on the social support issue. Wait till you see the data I will show you. And you're always here, so you're not going to miss it. But I will tell you, I'll save that answer for the chapter on stress and health. Okay? Just because you will be shocked by the findings, actually. And so we will visit that, and I will only ask you for your patience to wait to get there. Otherwise, it pulls the thunder out of that particular lecture that I arrived at that particular point in time. Okay? Good question. All right, so you see what the business is. We're talking about causality, and unfortunately, then, you see this has all kinds of moral implications, doesn't it? Because if we're going to apply the assumptions of science to behavioral science, we have taken away the concept of free will and responsibility for one's own behavior. That can still be a question, but it's going to be a question examined in the courts, not in the scientific laboratory. In every scientific laboratory, the assumption will be made that the behavior is a product of identifiable causal factors. So it kind of raises the question of that, how do you hold that person responsible? That's not a scientific question. That's a legal question. And the legal people, the courts, of course, do they have the same set of assumptions as science? No. Absolutely not. It's diametrically opposed. It's all based on free will. And the only time they'll make an exception is if the person is incapacitated to a degree that the court or the jury can be led to believe that, or made to believe, that the person did not have the capacity to exercise free will. So it's a very different arena. The universe of science is not the only universe, is what I'm trying to tell you. But make no mistake about it, if you're in it, leave your moral convictions at the door as you enter the laboratory about the nature of free will and the assumptions therein. And that's the way I do it. A lot of people, a lot of scientists are determinists from the beginning, from the minute they wake up to the minute they fall asleep that day. And obviously, that is a very agnostic religious orientation, a-religious, I should say. But there are many scientists who do believe, can believe, but they believe so. You always have to do multiple personality on yourself, right? When you're in the laboratory, you have a set of assumptions that dictate your behavior. When you leave, if you want to believe in God and all the variations of how He is worshipped, have at it. You have to lead two lives, though. They are incompatible sets of assumptions, and that's what's very important about these factors. Now, there is causality, and then there is this issue of association. There are certain things that are associated with one another, certain events that might be independent, dependent variables. Suffice it to say that if a correlation is found, it does not prove causality. Here's an important test question waiting to happen. If you can prove causality, those two variables will always be correlated. But if those variables are even highly correlated, it does not allow you to conclude that one has caused the other. Because it may be another variable that is creating the change in the dependent variable by some other method. Okay. So we've covered this. Goal of science of prediction, explanation, and control. Ultimately, when you get control, you pretty much have prediction down pat. Trick is getting control. I mean, no matter how many explanations you might hear for the very tragic phenomenon that occurred in Newtown, there are probably explanations galore, but obviously we can't predict. And unfortunately, most unfortunately, we cannot control the occurrence of these events in the future. So, scientists really, when push comes to shove, want to identify relationships in their slice of the universe, whether you're a physicist, biochemist, astronomer, psychologist, in their slice of the universe, they really hope to be able to control the phenomena that they are studying. So, enough said. You already know, you've heard it from as far back as high school, probably even before. I think you guys got out scientific method in grade school long before I did in my training. But you remember hypothesis testing. I like to think of hypotheses as a guess about the relationship between social support. If we didn't know anything about it, we could make a guess about the amount of social support and the length of life that one enjoys. That guess is an hypothesis. If we didn't know anything more about it, we would say strong social support attenuates morbidity and mortality, physical morbidity and mortality, meaning attenuates the likelihood of getting disease or death. That's an hypothesis. And some hypotheses in science done by the book are called null hypotheses. And I'll go over this very quickly. I'm not going to give you any trick questions on it because it's loaded with trick material. The null hypothesis that scientists test, all of them test null hypotheses. The null hypothesis is there is no effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. When, in fact, one performs a study and it shows no relationship between the independent and dependent variable, then one fails to reject the null hypothesis. If one finds a relationship between the independent and dependent variable, one is allowed to reject the null hypothesis and speculate about the nature of an alternative hypothesis, i.e., social support does adversely affect likelihood of disease and death. Okay. I'm going to go over I know you like review, and I've been trying to be succinct about, and my version of review is review all along. You've been there every time you've heard the test questions waiting to happen, and I'll tell you in a few minutes what you can expect on the test at the very end of this lecture. But do look at, in that chapter, a very readable chapter on certain methods, look at the presentation of the various ways of attempting to acquire knowledge about mental illness. Because that's the science. This is the science of psychopathology. We are interested in the dependent variable, some psychopathological condition, and how it's affected by various independent variables. I've done this research in this campus, and it's been done elsewhere as well, and I can tell you for a fact that 1 out of 4 women in this room were sexually abused before the age of 12. When that occurs, and you compare that 1/4 to those who have not reported childhood sexual abuse before the age of 12, you see the presence of more psychopathology in this group than in this group. That's the bad news. The good news is that the vast majority in both groups are doing well. Doing very well because, by definition, everybody in this room is getting very close to having a college degree. If I didn't give you that nugget before, if I say it now and I'll say it again later, you're getting a college degree alone will lengthen your life by several years. Did I already tell you that? I like to remind students of why they're spending all this money. All things controlled. Simply having a bachelor's degree puts years on your life. So, okay, point being, by definition, the women we studied in these survey research studies were already, by definition, functioning very well. They're very close to getting a bachelor's degree, and most reported no evidence of adverse effect. So, yet, that is an independent variable that can be studied against a dependent variable. Do women reporting a history of childhood sexual abuse before the age of 12 report more depression as adults? Very easy to study. And the answer is yes. But again, important to remember in this, way more do not. So there is a resilience in the human condition. And indeed, many of us practitioners, in my practitioner days, used to squeeze that for all it was worth, the resiliency that is, by saying, if they're myopic by definition, they have reported a psychopathological condition. And often, as I probably have already said before, I would be saying, how can we get this event into your rear view mirror, eventually out of sight? Because, as you know, the past cannot be changed. It's the present and the future that matters. So, for most then, and this is the good news that I was trying to refer to, for most, the vast majority of people reporting this phenomenon have already done that. Rear view mirror is so far out of sight that it doesn't really even matter anymore. That's a measure of health. They don't need a mental health profession. All right. The methods of science are described in the book. I'm not going to go into detail. Freud employed the weakest method of research strategy, research methodology, the case study. You can study unusual phenomena in the case study. You can draw conclusions about the effect of an independent variable on a dependent variable, but the level of control you have over that independent variable is almost zero. So it's a highly unreliable method that produces often invalid conclusions. I've already described epidemiology for you. I just described it again by saying when you compare one group that has a specific historical commonality, like a history of childhood sexual abuse, you can compare them to those who don't, and what comes out the other end is a relative risk for psychopathology based on the frequency in the one group compared to the frequency in the other group. If this group has twice as much psychopathology as this, then the risk factor is twice as much. Put another way, if someone has a history of childhood sexual abuse, to find the way I defined it, it might be that they are twice as likely to report depression as those who have not. That is epidemiology at its best. There are correlational studies in which we look for almost, I would say, at least 75% of the studies that we do in the social sciences are correlational studies, where we find associations between variables. But it is not until we manipulate the independent variable in real time and measure the effect of the dependent variable, that we have actual control, or what's called a true experimental design. Correlational studies give us an idea that there may be a causal relationship, but there is no causal relationship that has not been experimentally demonstrated, if it can be done. Again, when one finds a high correlation between two things, one should look further as to whether or not those variables are experimentally or, if you will, causally connected. So, experimental design then is when you take the phenomenon into the laboratory and start manipulating the things that affect that phenomenon and look for outcome later. I talked to you a little bit earlier, I think, in clinical assessment about how we have animal models for understanding. We can take mom away from her pups in the rat laboratory. Did I talk about this? Right? We can take her away from her pups for a few critical days during their development, or for a few hours each day. And then we can look and see how frightened they are in new situations as adults. That is experimental design, in which we're actually manipulating the event of the attachment relationship between mother and offspring, and then looking for psychological manifestations of that effect, and doing so using all of the control procedures that scientists tend to employ, like those that are employed in clinical trials. And indeed, listen to this unexpected proclamation. The pharmaceutical companies have in their arsenal of techniques of science the most powerful experimental design, because they can not only take a drug and give it to people in a very specified, measurable amount, but they can give it to them in something that looks exactly like it, but it has zero amount of the active ingredient. And that is pure, quintessentially pure experimental design, when you get the independent variable down to a zero level and compare it to an active amount. That creates a control group that can be compared to an experimental group, and of course what I just described to you is placebo. The only problem is in psychological research, placebos aren't really placebos. However, they have two problems. Number one, people do respond to placebos. And number two, when the placebo creates no response at all, and the drug creates a lot of side effects, as I said to you before, the side effects may be the signal for the placebo response to begin to occur, the expectation of improvement. When that happens, we have an absolutely textbook case of confounding. We are concluding it's the drug, and in fact, it is nothing more than the expectation of an effect based on the signals provided by the side effects, or so-called side effects. There really, in psychopharmacology, no such thing as a side effect. Okay. We blind researchers, pharmaceutical industry does, or they're supposed to anyhow. They blind the researchers so that they don't know who gets the placebo and who gets the active ingredient. We may blind the subject. They don't know what they're getting, one versus the other. By the way, as I may have indicated earlier, in studies of antidepressant drugs, you ask the people, what drug do you think you're on? Placebo or the antidepressant. There's a very high, greater than chance result that people know exactly which drug they're taking. That is very problematic for the assessment of these drugs. Okay. I'm not going to go through over anything on adoption and twin studies. I need to just remove that slide and perhaps that one as well. But the book has something on it. I'll tell you flat out, you're not going to get tested on it. This is our review, right? You're not going to get tested on that material. Now, I'll save as much time as I can. Let me just give you internal and external validity. Described in the book, it's really pretty simple. An experiment has internal validity when, in fact, you have isolated the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable to the exclusion of all other sources of influence. In other words, the conclusions you will draw about the finding are valid. But it must also often have external validity, and that means if your subjects, and our favorite subjects on campus here are, I think I already told you, you and the white rat. Sometimes you are not a good indication of what the general population looks like. You're too darn bright. You're too darn articulate. You're too darn knowing. So you see, as you separate yourself, you're probably separating yourself from 80% of the population right now. So as a subject, maybe only we can conclude, the conclusions we draw will be about college students your age. When we start talking about the middle-aged housewife reporting depression in midlife, what we find about you may have little applicability, i.e. it may suffer from external validity. External validity then might be low or bad. All studies should be replicated. All studies today, especially human studies, must be monitored. And your textbook will tell you, when you investigate human subjects, you must get their consent for the procedures you're going to employ, and you must ensure the subject that no harm will come to them as a result of participating. Sometimes we lie to subjects. There's a more sophisticated term for that in science. It's called deception. We will flat out lie to somebody, and I'll tell you about a study that I performed with some cardiologists at Vanderbilt in Tennessee. We flat out lied to these people. Suffice it to say for now, when you do that, at the end of the study, you are obligated to debrief the subject and tell them that they were lying to you. And on top of that, as you'll find out when I talk about the study that I was involved in, I had to give them my card with my cell phone number on it saying, call 24/7. If there's any aspect of what we've done to you has caused you any kind of harm. That's the responsibility one has to perform ethical experiments. I'll stop there and say that if you've been here every day of class, this test will be a walk in the park because the textbook is easy reading. Kiss it goodbye and consider yourself lucky because the next one is likely to be significantly harder, and it is all new because of DSM-5 being incorporated into it. So, what's the test on? It's on that. It's on those chapters. If you read those 4 chapters, think about. By the way, let me just tell you this. This is just a suggestion. I don't know if anybody's tried this before. I got it a little late in college, but I started figuring out how to get good grades on multiple choice tests. When I read the material, I started thinking, all right, if I had to make a test question that was multiple choice, what would it be on this concept? And you know what? I found out about 90% of the time I was right. Start doing that. You will probably make the test that you will see on Monday. Monday morning, 11:45. You are not coming here. You can be in Las Vegas if you want. But you better be near a computer, and you have 15 minutes to get on it. When you get on it, you have an hour to complete it, and you won't need an hour because you're all so well prepared. Have a great weekend.
she given life.